Hello and welcome to the Arabic Hour. My name is Ghanwa Hakim. On today's program, our guest is Jeff Klein, a local anti-war pro-Palestine activist who's recently returned from a trip to the Middle East, including visits to Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine.
Americans should be aware that the narrative that everybody in Syria is against the dictatorship, the regime, is certainly false. It's hard to gauge how much support the government has, but it certainly has substantial support. It had before the conflict began, and it continues to have a lot of support, both among the various minorities and among the urban Sunni population as well. It's not a sectarian regime, as is often asserted. It's not an Alawite regime. Claim to support is that it's a secular national regime that's non-sectarian, that attempts to unite all Syrians of various religious and ethnic groups. And that view has a lot of support in Syria, especially when the opposition is increasingly sectarian, Islamist, or ethnic.
Jeff Klein is a retired machinist and local union president active with the anti-war group Dorchester People for Peace and several Palestine solidarity organizations. He is a board member of Massachusetts Peace Action and a leader of its Palestine-Israel Working Group. He is also the statewide coordinator of the New Day initiative to change U.S. policy on Israel Palestine, which focuses on our elected officials. Since 2004, Jeff has traveled almost every year to Palestine, Israel, and elsewhere in the Middle East, including Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, most recently including Syria in 2016. He has many close friends among veteran activists in these countries. In July 2009, he participated in the Viva Palestina relief convoy to Gaza, organized by British MP George Galloway. Jeff has spoken many times about the Israel-Palestine issue in schools, churches, community and peace organizations, mosques, and has appeared on local and international TV and radio. He has also published articles and op-ed pieces on U.S. policy and Middle East issues. And now to Elaine with our conversation on Syria along with Jeff.
Thank you, Ghanwa. We are happy to have with us today Jeff Klein, our old friend. Welcome back to Arabic Hour.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You just came back about a month ago from a trip that took you to Lebanon, Palestine, and Syria. You actually got into Syria with a delegation, and you were able to observe what is going on there. Even got up to Palmyra, which was recently freed from ISIS, and we want to hear about your observations. First, can you give us a little understanding, a kind of context for understanding what is going on in Syria from the time just before the beginnings of the Troubles in 2011? So give us a little bit of an understanding.
Well, I think the starting point for looking at Syria today is to understand that there are factors about the conflict that are internal and factors, I would argue, larger factors that are external to Syria. There's been a not very democratic government in Syria since the 70s, since the Assad regime was founded.
There wasn't one before either. There were 15 coups before it came, yes.
And, without a doubt, there were lots of people in Syria that wanted some change, some reform and change. But within that context, there were many interests outside of Syria that saw the desire for change and reform inside Syria as a wedge for attacking the state and government of Syria itself. And to my mind, whatever the origins, democratic and not so democratic, of the opposition to the government, the external factors have taken the major role now. And it's the intervention in Syria that is causing the conflict to continue, and I would say also blocking any chance for reform within Syria. So
Can
that's in a
you
nutshell.
talk a little bit about the external factors? I mean, we know that the United States and Israel, for example, have a long history since the Hafez al-Assad came into office in 1970, accumulated power, united Syria, joined, was first receiving arms from the Soviet Union, joined in an alliance with Iran, which in some ways replaced the Soviet Union when that went defunct, and Hezbollah. From that point on, this state was seen as a pariah state in the West. And we do know there's a lot of literature, and there were a lot of machinations among the U.S. government, for example, and Zionist and right-wing Lebanese forces in America trying to overthrow the regime of Hafez al-Assad. So can you talk a little bit about some of these external factors? I can fill in some of the things that went on here in the United States, if you like.
Well, of course, the hostility of the U.S. government to Syria goes back to the days of the Cold War, initially.
Yes.
During that era, Syria was one of the outposts of Arab nationalism. It was armed and allied with the Soviet Union then, like Egypt, like Nasser's Egypt, and was a country that maintained its resistance to Israel and the Zionist project in the Middle East, to which the U.S. became very deeply allied. So the U.S. was always hostile to the Ba'athist government of Syria. After the end of the Cold War, the realignment at the end and following the end of the Cold War of Syria with Iran on one side and the Lebanese resistance, Hezbollah, on the other side, also became kind of replaced the kind of Cold War orientation that had existed before. In other words, they were the official enemy in the Middle East. And the strategic goal of the U.S. and its allies was to break this alliance between Syria, Iran, and Hezbollah for a variety of reasons. One, a powerful Hezbollah was a threat to Israel and helped to maintain the independence of Lebanon. Iran was the sort of strategic enemy of the U.S. and Israel in the Middle East. And a secular regime, was also automatically the enemy of the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia and Qatar in particular, and eventually of Turkey also, which was establishing a kind of modern Islamist regime. So Syria was surrounded by enemies who didn't always agree on why they were hostile to Syria, but for their own reasons agreed that Syria, the Ba'athist regime, had to go, in a sense, if it was unwilling to break this alliance, this resistance alliance. And during the early 2000s, there were a lot of carrots as well as sticks that were offered to the regime to break that alliance. And ultimately, when it became clear that the alliance was going to remain, the alternative was to overthrow the government of Syria. And the Arab Spring in 2011 gave the opportunity to intervene.
Yes, I mean, this is, I think, a very important history. But one thing we should note is that actually the alliance between Syria and Iran started actually directly after the '79 revolution. And it was formalized in 1982. So even while it was involved with the Soviet Union, it had already developed an alliance. And Syria gave a great deal of support to Iran during the Iran-Iraq war, which the U.S. was happy to see happen so they could both sort of hurt each other in the Middle East. And then after, of course, Syria got in trouble, Iran has been a help to Syria. But let us go on and talk a little bit more about what you actually saw in Syria, giving this background, this understanding. So go ahead, tell us how you got to Syria first.
So I should say first, I had been to Syria once before in 2009, before the current conflict began. And Syria, for many reasons, is a very interesting place to visit, not the least because of its cultural heritage and what you can see as a center of Arabic culture, especially in the north and west of the Arab world. And I had fully intended to go again sometime. Remember, back before the conflict, I was on my way from Lebanon to Palestine, and it was very normal to go overland from Beirut to Damascus, Damascus to Deraa, and then into Jordan. And I assumed I would do that again another time. Of course, now you can't do that.
Yeah.
So when I was planning this trip last March and April, I was hoping to revisit Syria, and not just as a tourist, but also to observe and sort of learn and do some writing about the situation in Syria. Turns out it's almost impossible for an American citizen to get a visa to Syria now.
Yeah, so how did you manage to do that?
So I started to look into getting a visa, and it became impossible. And meanwhile, I heard about this group that was organizing tours to Syria. They call it peace tours to Syria. And it was interesting. This organization is headed by Palestinians who now live in Lebanon, Jordan, and Australia. And actually, the guy in Australia was the one organizing it. It's one of these miraculous things of the modern day communications that you can be in touch with someone in Australia and make arrangements for this trip. And I kind of took a chance, paid a deposit, and this guy promised he'd get, I would be part of this delegation, and that's the way it developed. Meanwhile, while I was on my way back to Beirut to leave, the delegation gathered in Beirut and went by bus to Damascus. We heard that everybody could get visas except the two Americans. The Syrian government is very suspicious about Americans, justifiably so. And it was only with I gather, some pulling of strings within the government that eventually we got our visa. So we gathered in Beirut. This organization sent a bus from Damascus to pick us up in Beirut and take us to Damascus, which you know is only an hour and a half or so away.
Mm-hmm. 60 miles.
Yeah. It takes a little time. The border is complicated. You have to get out of Lebanon and then into Syria. It took a little time, but it went quite smoothly. And we arrived in Damascus. We stayed at Babtuma, which is part of the old city of Damascus, in one of these refurbished old mansions that, especially before the
now
war.
Boutique hotels.
Yes, before the war, there was really a perspective to build up tourism in Syria, and one of the means was to refurbish these old buildings in the old city, which had been mostly abandoned by the big bourgeoisie in Syria, had moved into the more modern suburbs. And so we stayed in a hotel in a beautiful old house, and we had the services of a young man who was not officially part of the government, but obviously had connections.
Sort of a minder, yeah.
And also what they called a cultural guide, someone who had been a professional tour guide, who helped to give us, some of the historical and architectural background. So we were based the whole time. It was a week. We were a week in Syria. We were based the whole time in the old city, and spent some time walking around. We were free to come and go during our free time, talk to people on the street. There was the parliamentary elections were going on when we first got there too.
April.
And then we went by bus to Homs. Spent a day there, which I'll talk about. Then we heard we were going to get permission to go to Tadmor, Palmyra, which had just been liberated from Daesh, ISIS, a few days before, and it was very complicated.
Daesh being ISIS.
Yes. Daesh is the Arabic acronym for ISIS. So it took a little more time to get all the permissions to go to Tadmor. Remember, this had been a war zone a few days before. We had to get permission from the Syrian military, the Syrian intelligence services, and the Russian military, because the Russian forces were involved in Palmyra and the liberation of Palmyra. So it was a little complicated. So our trip there was delayed a day, and we went on that day to Sueda, which is a city in the south of Syria, mostly Druze.
Yes.
And had a very interesting time there, and eventually the next day made it to Palmyra, which we were the first foreign delegation to visit.
Tell us what you saw. What understanding did you get about the fighting?
So again, it needs to be said we were in the government controlled part of Syria for the whole time, and within that we had many meetings, both official and unofficial, and talked to people. Especially the most interesting, and I think unofficial source of information was in the restaurants around Damascus, where we ate and sort of mingled with people and talked to them. As you know, in the old city, there are a lot of really nice restaurants, traditional restaurants, and we walked around during the day the elections were held and talked to a lot of people in the street there. And then the rest of the time, we had sort of semi-official meetings with people. We met with church people and with Druze leaders and civil leaders in Homs. And of course, in Palmyra, we were sort of under military escort when we were there, because the area was still pretty dangerous. So we got a pretty varied picture of what
is your assessment of the situation, and especially of the military situation in terms of who controls what? We have a map that we'll show on the screen that it purports to show, and it's the most recent map, the different areas and what control they're under. So can you give us a rough idea of your understanding?
So from our experience, it's important to understand, we have these maps that show the sort of front lines and so on, like World War I, World War II, but the actual situation in Syria is much more fluid than that. The fighting, the numbers that are doing the fighting on all sides are relatively small compared to, say, European wars. And there aren't front lines, so to speak, like continuous front lines or large numbers of troops. Instead, there are relatively small units that attack given, towns and villages, and kind of back and forth. It's much more fluid than the maps would indicate. Even when we went to Palmyra, it had been recaptured, a few days before, and a few days after we left, part of the road from Homs to Palmyra was retaken by Daesh troops. So it's kind of fluid. It's not like large-scale battles. And a lot of it takes place in the cities or the suburbs of the cities, where groups of fighters are cheek by jowl, right near each other, and they don't always fight. Sometimes there are local truces, temporary truces, and so on. So it's very complicated. Even Homs had been liberated by the government a couple of years before, or a year before we were there. And yet there are still areas of Homs that are under rebel influence, and parts of the city that are destroyed,
and some that's being rebuilt.
And some that's being, we observed that actually in Homs especially. The anti-government people had held Homs, most of Homs, for a long time.
Yes.
And the fighting was very heavy, and there were large neighborhoods that were in ruins in Homs. For instance, we visited the Chaldea neighborhood in Homs, which had block upon block of sort of shells of buildings. It looked like something from the bombings in World War II. And yet, when we were there was a government group rebuilding the Khalid ibn Walid Mosque, the famous mosque in that neighborhood that the neighborhood is named after. They were rebuilt. They had been fighting in and right around the mosque, and they were rebuilding it right then. And in the old city, the old souk, there were also shops were reopening for the first time. So there were the beginnings of a recovery there.
Jeff, tell us what you saw in Palmyra first. Was the destruction of some of the really fine remains extensive? What did you see there, and did you get into Tadmor itself,
Yes.
the village?
Yeah, yes, people need to understand. So Palmyra, what we call Palmyra, the ancient ruins,
Called Tadmor.
called Tadmor, and there's a town that grew up near the ruins, in part because of tourism and so on. It became a sort of bustling town, and it was the town as well as the ruins that were occupied by Daesh. And in the town itself, there was pretty heavy fighting and very, very widespread destruction. When we were there, it was a Friday, and for the first time, most of the residents had fled the town when Daesh took it over. And when we were there, it was the first time that people had an opportunity to go back and visit their homes and shops, but they weren't allowed to stay because it was still too dangerous. There were mines in the town, there was no water and electricity, but people were allowed to come back and retrieve their belongings, basically. So while we were there were buses and trucks everywhere of people loading up with their household goods and so on, leaving back to the government-controlled areas where they had been staying essentially as displaced people. So the town itself had been under Daesh control for the better part of a year, and we saw some evidence. There were graffiti on the walls and so on. They had, as they do elsewhere, attempted to sort of establish a religious-based rule locally. So the town itself had suffered a lot. The ruins of this, which were relatively well preserved, ancient ruins, also suffered because in the light of their Daesh's sort of religious fanaticism, any ancient ruins were considered haram, not legitimate under their view of Islam. And so they damaged.
Their view of Islam being that you can't see reproductions that, with sort of ancient gods and so forth. And so they destroyed these.
So they destroyed the museum, which we visited outside. The inside was completely destroyed. Statues had been overturned and defaced. And then in the actual ruins, the parts that had been relatively well preserved, they blew up. Two very famous parts of the ruins. There was the Temple of Baal, which was one of the best preserved ancient buildings anywhere, and there was a monumental gateway, an arch gateway that still had survived with its archway, and they blew up both of those things, and so much. And then they destroyed the hotels and restaurants that had, for tourists that had been in that area. So much so that it was very touching. Our guide, whose name was Antoine, who had been to Palmyra hundreds of times, he was a professional guide, began to weep when he was in the ruins, and it was very moving. We had never seen it in its,
It was beautiful. I can tell you it was beautiful.
Yeah. So it was just an act of vandalism to destroy this. The one well-preserved ancient monument in Palmyra that they had not blown up was the theater. There's a very well-preserved theater there. And they had left that as a kind of monument. You probably know Daesh had executed dozens of captured Syrian soldiers in the theater in a kind of grisly performance that they taped and put on the internet. And so they left the theater intact as their sort of monument. But while we were there also, I should say, there were specialized Syrian and Russian engineer troops that were demining the town and the ruins. And while we were walking around, we could hear the explosions of the mines. It was basically they had electronic means to find the mines and detonate them. And it's a little nerve-wracking to hear these explosions.
Tell us if you can, sort of politically, what you sensed is happening there. I mean, you have the Russians in there. You have American Special Forces. You have British Special Forces. You have French Special Forces. And they're supposed to be training, and they have actually been in combat. And then you have a Kurdish force, which apparently has been very effective in the north, and that you can see is the yellow part on the map. And they say there is a Syrian democratic force there. And this force has Kurdish fighters and it has Arab militias, not defined.
Right.
We know the Kurdish fighters have been very effective and the U.S. supports them, Turkey worries about them, and so forth. And then you have the ISIS, and you have al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda, and you have Ahrar al-Sham, and you have Jaish al-Sham, and you have the government forces. Tell us, how did you size up what's happening there politically? Is it really going to you, did it look like it might be falling apart as a country, or that there was still some coherence and that the people under government control, they tend to still favor government control? What were you able to capture from people, conversations?
Well, without the ability to be very scientific about it, I can say that Americans should be aware that the narrative that everybody in Syria is against the dictatorship, the regime, is certainly false. It's hard to gauge how much support the government has, but it certainly has substantial support. It had before the conflict began and continues to have a lot of support. I mean, objectively, people reported that there were 2 million Ba'ath Party members before the conflict began. That's out of a country of 22 million people. And even though some of them may have been opportunists or quit or gone over to the other side, there's still a substantial social base for the regime, both among the various minorities and among the urban Sunni population as well. It's not a sectarian regime, as is often asserted. It's not an Alawite regime, even though the Alawites are influential in the regime, and of course that's the background of the Assads. Its claim to support is that it's a secular national regime that's non-sectarian, that attempts to unite all Syrians of various religious and ethnic groups. And that view has a lot of support in Syria, especially when the opposition is increasingly sectarian, Islamist, or ethnic. So in addition to the core support of the regime, particularly the religious and ethnic minorities also see the survival of the regime as their only potential to survive as Syrians in Syria in the future. We spoke to Christians and Druze and so on, and it's quite clear that whatever the democratic aspirations of some of the people who rose up against the government, it's clear that the future is going to be decided on the battlefield. And on the battlefield, the so-called democratic opposition is insignificant. So many people see the alternatives as either the current regime with some hope of reform in the long run, or a sectarian Islamist regime of one flavor or another. And it's important for us as Americans to understand that the so-called moderates, fighters that we support, are for the most part radical Islamists, as well as the al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, and ISIS. They just have, the ideology is similar, organizationally their origin is different, and maybe there are different groups of foreign fighters with al-Nusra and ISIS, but the vision of most of the fighting opposition to the government, their vision is not democracy. Their vision is a sectarian Islamist Sunni state in which Christians, Druze, and Alawites and other minorities have no future in Syria. So those are, practically speaking, those are the alternatives that most Syrians see. And my understanding is that probably a majority of Syrians would prefer the government that they have to that kind of alternative.
You are watching the Arabic Hour with Jeff Klein discussing the situation in Syria. We'll be back with more after this short program ID.
You are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
We are here a group in solidarity with Syria.
نحن هون مجموعة للتضامن مع السوريين.
So I'm from America.
هو أمريكي.
So first I have to apologize for the policy of my government.
أول شيء أنا بعتذر عن السياسة اللي عم تتبعها حكومتي تجاهكم.
We don't support that policy.
نحن ما بندعم هيك السياسة تجاه سوريا.
So we wish you all in Syria a long life in a sovereign country.
نتمنى لكم حياة طويلة بلد محافظ على سيادته.
Where everyone can live the way they like to live.
بلد فيه بيعيش الناس على الطريقة اللي بيحبوا يعيشوا فيها.
Thank you for your hospitality.
I mean, let's face it, the U.S. and Israel, and increasingly, of course, Saudi Arabia, have been trying to bring down Syria for a long time. And we know, for example, that there were efforts in Congress. They passed the Syrian Accountability Act. There were conferences that were sponsored by Daniel Pipes and right-wing Lebanese in this country. We know that Mera Wormser also did a conference. It's all in 2000, 2003. In 2004, you had the Accountability Act. You had the UN resolution. 2003 was the Accountability Act in Congress. You had a UN resolution 1559, led by the delegation pressuring for it. It was led by Walid Faris, who is he's a Lebanese American who believes that he's not an Arab and that Christian Lebanese are not Arabs. And he pushes through. Walid Faris is the advisor to Donald Trump on the Middle East.
And he was a member of an organization that basically
Yes.
committed war crimes in Lebanon.
Yes,
during the Civil War.
absolutely. So you have this long history. And then, of course, you also had the focus on Hezbollah. And then you have the Israelis worrying about Iran, not really for its nuclear development. Netanyahu's been singing that song since the 1990s about Iran and imminent danger and so forth. They tried every one of the links in this alliance to break one and have the whole thing fall.
Right.
And they tried Hezbollah in 2006. They started bombing it again. Of course, they didn't leave Lebanon until 2000. Then 2006, they again bombed the area and had the attack. They tried very hard to not only increase sanctions on Iran, but Israel was also trying to get the U.S. to go to war with Iran. Syria, while they always had an understanding with Assad about the Golan Heights, Syrians never violated that ceasefire. Nonetheless, the Israelis wanted internal dissension within Syria that would weaken it. And I think what is very interesting here is the Saudi-Israeli connection. And I would ask people to look at the fact that in spite of the fact that ISIS, or Daesh as it's known in Arabic, in spite of the fact that they say they're anti-Israel, they're supposedly these deep fundamentalists, never once have they attacked Israel. They've reached Libya, they've reached Lebanon, they've reached Iraq, they've reached everywhere, but not once. And if you recall, they had a lot of propaganda around how the Israelis were helping these Syrian rebel fighters. Many of them were Nusra people.
Not propaganda. It's absolutely true.
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm sorry. I meant that they were proposing that no, their propaganda was that they were helping them. It was propaganda that they were helping them, and the point is, yes, they were taking them in and supporting them, and using it as propaganda to say, see, even though they hate us, we're taking
Right.
care of them.
That
So
part is propaganda.
It was
for sure.
propaganda. And so the point is that they were helping those that helped them. They have an agreement that they will not attack Israel. So, and you may even remember there was a Druze Israeli doctor who came last few months and talked about the fact that he is Israeli and he's been treating these people. And again, this is to, the propaganda is we treat them because we're humane, even though they're our enemy. So, you know, so this is really by way of asking you and looking at the history of Syria as having been constantly pressured to change the regime, and then Bush wanted them to change their behavior when they couldn't change the regime. And then Obama thought they could negotiate. Now it was, again, you know, Assad has got to go. We know there need to be reforms. We know that dictatorships are not acceptable. But I ask people, with recognition that I'm a critic of the Syrian government and of some of the means that they have used, what alternative could the Syrians have when the people keep saying, well, they're not democratic and they're totalitarian and they kill their own people and blah, 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 and all this stuff about barrel bombs and whatnot. So what alternative do they have when they have all these forces, especially from the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia, and now Turkey? How could you have a democratic election and deal with all of this? And you know, so the U.S. refuses to work with Assad. Everyone recognizes, even in the halls of Congress, they recognize that you need to work with Assad to get rid of ISIS, even though the U.S. probably was involved initially in allowing this to happen. So tell me your assessment of where the U.S., because you're interested in it, where does the U.S. stand in all of this, having perhaps supported Saudi Arabia in this enterprise with ISIS and supports the Israelis, and yet at the same time they're bombing ISIS?
So I want to respond to that and also talk about Syrian society a little bit.
Right.
But, let me first respond to that. So obviously there's an array of outside forces that agree on deposing the regime in Syria, the government, Syrian government. But within that sort of loose alliance, they don't all see eye to eye about how to go about it and what the alternative is.
Yes.
And so, for example, the U.S. is supporting the Kurds in the east and north of Syria, which Turkey is at war with, effectively. Qatar and Saudi Arabia are supporting Islamist opposition within Syria that is at least ideologically not very distinguishable from al-Nusra and Daesh, which the U.S. in theory is opposing. Israel has a tacit alliance with the al-Nusra, al-Qaeda people on its border.
And Saudi Arabia. Mm-hmm.
And Saudi Arabia too. So there are differences within the forces opposing the Syrian government. And my impression is that the U.S. recognizes that there's no victory in this, given the actual forces on the ground in Syria, and is toying with the idea of Plan B. Plan B being to effectively dismember Syria as a unified state and have some kind of, they may call it as a fig leaf, a federal state with local autonomy, especially for the Kurds. And we'll see.
Just like Biden wanted in Iraq.
Yes, we'll see in the coming months and years whether this is really promoted overtly. But the reality is that it doesn't seem that either side can win a decisive victory on the battlefield. There's a lot of ebb and flow around the fringes, but the armed opposition to the government doesn't have the means or the heavy weaponry that they would need to overthrow the government, and the government itself is short of manpower, especially.
Although some of the rebels have been defecting to the government.
Some, but it's also not very well noted, but among the Syrian refugees that we see going to Europe, there's a very high proportion of young men who are trying to escape the draft.
Yes.
So the Syrian Arab army is shorthanded in terms of soldiers, and has suffered a lot, especially in the areas that were heavily recruited as part of the professional army in the coastal area, the Alawite area. I mean, every village, I'm told, has dozens or hundreds of martyrs in them. So there's a kind of exhaustion on the part of the government. So there's a kind of neither side can win, and from some outside points of view, that may be okay. The U.S. is supplying enough to the rebels to keep them in the field, in effect, and meanwhile Syria is kind of just, weakened, which certainly the Israelis want, the Turks want, and the
that's
US
what
wants.
they call a tolerable level.
Yeah, so that's what I see as the strategic level. The Russians and the Iranians are supplying enough military aid to the government to guarantee that it won't collapse. I don't think the idea that there's going to be a collapse of the government and a military victory of the armed opposition, I think that's gone. And that was Plan A. Plan A was that the regime would just be overthrown. If need be, some of the armed opposition at the beginning had this sort of Libyan plan that they would have enough credible opposition to justify an overt intervention by the U.S. and NATO that would then the government would fall as the Gaddafi regime in Syria. So I don't think that's going to happen. There's not going to be a no-fly zone.
That never was really in the workings, because the Syrians really, even the opposition within, the secular opposition within Syria, never allowed themselves to be aligned with the U.S. They did not want U.S. intervention or any intervention. So these outside Syrian expatriates that were egging the U.S. on were really disliked by the people inside. And then some of them began to be weaned when things were getting real bad. Then the Russians came in. So, and right now, I mean, the only way you can portray Syria is there are probably 50 or 100 or 200 different groups. We think of Nusra and Daesh and Ahrar al-Sham and Jaish al-Sham, and these are the main groups. But in fact, there are hundreds of them. Liwa al-Sham, they have all kinds of names, and they keep going over to one or the other, whoever pays them more. Right. And some of them, there's not even necessarily that religious commitment.
Yeah.
And they, a good part of them love their black label quite a bit. So you have all these factions now fighting. You have a government that can't really recapture the whole of Syria. You have ISIS, which wanes. I think in the end ISIS will probably not survive in Syria and Iraq over the long term, because it's trying to manage too much land like a state, and it drains their energy, which is why they've taken to outside activities such as in Libya. It may be that Saudi Arabia will negotiate the existence of a caliphate in a weakened form, and that the Saudis will control it, primarily because they also don't want ISIS to think they can come and liberate Mecca and Medina. So there's a lot of dynamics there, and it's almost like Yanon's 1980 article for Israel, which said the best thing to do is split them up into sectarian groups or into pieces and make them weak in the whole Arab world. Whether that is fulfilling of that strategy or not, and in effect you have these pieces falling apart. So the question is, how long can you go without this being a spillover into a larger area, which it's already begun to do, whether it's the attacks in Paris, whether it's what's happening in Libya. Where do you see this going? What do you imagine? What do you think the Syrians imagine as the end of this?
Well, of course, I know what some Syrians think, and I guess it's important to understand that a society in a country is more than just the government.
Yes.
And the most enlightening part of visiting Syria was to get a sense of what the society was like outside of politics per se. Now, it's true that the government, the Ba'athist government, is not very democratic. But it does have values, some of which are good values. Its values of modernization, non-sectarian, modern culture, equality of women, are all values that we, think are good values. And within the context of a non-democratic regime, they are promoted. And so if you walk around Damascus, you see people who may not be as free as they would like to be politically, but are very free in their cultural, social, and private life.
Yes.
And so you see people in restaurants walking on the street, singing and dancing, men and women, in ways that would be impossible under the kind of regime that the U.S. and its allies are supporting as the alternative. And especially, it was very touching when we were in Homs. When you go on these organized delegations, you have a lot of meetings, official meetings with people, and you learn something from that, but it's also somewhat canned, right?
Yes.
So the most insightful episodes were the ones that were not planned, I think. And so after we met with the governor of the Homs district, and we learned a lot about the plans for rebuilding the city and so on. But after that meeting, he took us next door. There was a theater. And this was obviously not something that was planned for our benefit. The theater was full, and amazingly, in the middle of the ruins of Homs, the theater, it was an event to promote awareness and understanding of people with mental disabilities, and especially children. And the theater was full of families. There were doctors who spoke and students from school who spoke. They put on skits, the kind of thing that you might see at any progressive, event in, Boston or outside of Boston, arguing that people should treat mental disabilities as part of society and have high expectations. And the most touching part of it was there was a skit of children with Down syndrome. And they had a kind of presentation. They spoke. There were slides, and on the stage, there was one child with Down syndrome and one child without that were sort of partnered, and arguing that they shouldn't be shunned. There should be high expectations. They had the opportunity to live, a full life and so on, with music and slides. And then the parents came up on stage. So, we were all weeping at this. I mean, it was so touching. And this was in the middle of this war, had nothing to do with politics in the big sense. It had to do with values of society. And this is what's under attack by the U.S. and its allies.
Yes.
My view is that the politics can be reformed, potentially, under the current regime.
Yes.
Under a caliphate, there's no room for reform, and there's no room for a modern kind of society and modern values.
That's right.
So that's what's at stake in Syria, as far as I'm concerned. It's not just politics.
And what is interesting here, though, is that the government, especially under Hafiz al-Assad, though people loved and hated him because he was tough, they loved Bashar more, but they loved the Assad family because they brought so much. It was free education, free health care.
Right.
kind of forward-looking in terms of understanding that education of the youth is the strength of the country. You know, kind of Bernie Sanders notion. So that what has always fascinated me is Syria is pragmatic too. I mean, it's an Arab nationalist state, but you remember in the Gulf War, '91, Syria was part of the coalition. It did it because pragmatically the U.S. allowed it to stay in Lebanon, which was a country torn off from Syria during the French colonialism. And where Syria felt it had a lot of interest. Now the Lebanese didn't want them, and of course any occupation is not fun. But for Hafez al-Assad, having control of a country that's not particularly strong, it got chips for negotiation from being in Lebanon, as it did from housing some of the Palestinians. So pragmatically, it joined the coalition, and all of its progressive supporters were very angry about that.
Right.
And on the other hand, it observes the UN ceasefire line in the Golan. It hasn't really attacked American interests. Its main problem is that it is part of an anti-imperialist, even if in name only, alliance. And because the values of Syria are certainly, many of them are much better than what we have here, given the resources of Syria in terms of free healthcare, free education, and so forth. So this is why the interesting thing is that we have to have a lot of propaganda that Syria and Assad are hateful people.
Right.
And the regime is hateful, and the society, you know, is suffering. Most of those people who are refugees were not fleeing from Assad. They were fleeing from the rebels bringing destruction on them. That doesn't mean the regime didn't bomb and cause some of the refugee problem.
No, the propaganda is a very good point. You
Yeah.
remind me to say something about that. Anyone in the U.S. who sort of reads the mainstream press or even attempts to follow events more closely will come across routinely quoted sources from about what's going on in Syria that, with a little digging, always invariably turn out to be connected with the opposition and funded by the U.S. or its allies. Yeah. So, of course, it doesn't mean everything that they say is false, but it means there needs to be a really powerful skepticism about the news that we're being fed from Syria. I mean, obviously, both sides in a war,
of course,
tell lies, but the way our press coverage works, whatever the government says is automatically dismissed as false, and whatever all these NGOs, many of whom are just fake,
yes,
whatever they say is treated as kind of gospel. And I think the proper view to understand what's going on in Syria in our press and even on the internet is to be very skeptical. And since the narrative that we're being fed most of the time is the opposition narrative, that's what we have to be the most skeptical about. From the point of view of our press coverage, the Syrian army only kills civilians.
Yeah.
That's the impression you get. Somehow you have this maniacal army that only wants to bomb hospitals. Yeah. And it doesn't mean that sometimes there are atrocities committed or hospitals, but you get the impression that the government is this genocidal,
and that intentionally regime. Does this. Yes.
And the other side are these humanitarian, secular, feminist supporters. And of course, it's not true. It's not true.
I mean, the Free Syrian Army doesn't really exist, and those who were in it are vacationing in Qatar.
Right. And there are certainly atrocities committed by the opposition. More so, I would say, than the government, and the figures that are often bandied about that Assad has killed 270,000 people. In fact, the largest number of fatalities within whatever the figure is are government security forces that have suffered thousands and thousands of deaths. But you're never told that. It's as though somehow this government is just massacring civilians, and It's not true. I mean, despite the fact that we know in wartime civilians do suffer from both sides, but it's not that the government is all evil and the rebels are all
Well, I mean, look at how many times our own drones have hit weddings and so forth.
So take with a grain of salt. Every one of these NGOs, if you follow them, they often have use the same template on their websites and their communications. And if you dig a little bit, they always say they're independent, non-sectarian, independently funded. If you dig a little bit, they're always, like the White Helmets or many of these medical groups, they're always turn out to be connected with the armed rebels and are funded from outside. So people who care about Syria need to read a lot and weigh things carefully.
Let me ask you one final question of this interview, and then allow you to say anything further you would like to say. And that is, we have two candidates for president. We have a Hillary Clinton who says she wants to, or had been saying, she wants to establish a free zone for refugees, that Assad has got to go, and that she's going to be tough. And part of her entourage of advisors on the Middle East is Dennis Ross and Robert Kagan and so forth. And then we have Trump, who from day to day changes, but basically is saying that ISIS has got to go and that he's going to take care of that. They've got to get rid of them. And he has as his advisor Walid Faris, who hates Arabs. So what, and then we have, of course, Netanyahu and Lieberman in Israel, and we have the cuckoos in Saudi Arabia. We have Erdogan in Turkey, who is more focused on the Kurds than anything else. But here are our two candidates. They could carry a lot of clout with all of these characters. What are we to expect? Something worse? More of the same? You know, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, let me say first what people in the Middle East are saying. You know, it will come as a surprise to a lot of Americans that people around the world, and especially in the Middle East, follow American politics very closely.
Very closely.
And they know much more about our politics than a typical American knows about the geography and politics of the Middle East. Why? Because what happens in the U.S. affects them much more powerfully than what happens there affects people in the United States. So people everywhere in Syria and Palestine and Jordan and Lebanon are watching this presidential campaign very closely. And I would say the consensus of what I heard, and frankly I don't disagree, people know and dislike Hillary Clinton very, very much in the Middle East. Why? Because she has a record. She has the record of intervening in Libya, advocating more intervention in Syria, being very, very tight with the Israeli government and so on. So she's a known quantity and a known hostile quantity to the Arab world. Trump is somebody new from their point of view, and many people in the Middle East had some hope, I would say not very rationally, but they had some hope that Trump at least was different. They knew Hillary and that sort of whole history of liberal interventionism in the Arab world was bad. A lot of people had the idea that maybe Trump would be something different.
I think he certainly would be.
And unpredictable. So I don't necessarily agree with that point of view, but you can sympathize with people's attitude. In other words, you have a known quantity that's very hostile to you.
Yes.
And this sort of unpredictable, somewhat unestablishment person on the other side. So I would say many people in the Middle East, for that reason, were more hopeful of Trump than of Clinton.
I guess it's also the reason why people, when they talked about the difference between Cruz and Trump, said they preferred Trump to Cruz, because Cruz is a known entity. Well, would you like to say anything more about Syria before we go on to our next interview on Palestine?
Well, I even before this visit, I would have to say I feel very sympathetic to the people in Syria. They're beautiful people. As you know, I mean, in the Arab world as a whole, there are, beautiful qualities of welcoming and hospitality and so on. We felt palpably welcome as foreigners who were not opposing, not joined with the rebels, not opposing their government. And we were cheered in many places in the restaurants where we were. And at one restaurant, I got up and said a few words, which, to a lot of applause, and then was dragged out to dance with some Syrian women. So to me, it was emotionally, Syrians deserve to have a decent life in their country without foreign intervention. And they deserve the opportunity to work out their own government as they see fit. And I would really hope that they have that opportunity, as anyone should have. And if it means tolerating a government that is not as democratic as we would like,
but with hopes that there are reforms,
yes,
and that eventually, if the outside world leaves them alone, they might move on.
I think there was evidence, by the way, in the early years of Bashar Assad's government, yes, that there were movements in the direction of reform, and even the first response to the Arab Spring were some reforms and so on. So I would say leave them alone to work out their future. The future of Syria needs to be worked out by Syrians, and I'm pretty confident that that if the foreign intervention that's destroying their country stops, they will work out a future that that they prefer. And there are lots of elements that exist now in Syrian society that are really good values and good elements that will be part of that future. And that's the hope for Syria, I think.
Well, I thank you very much for this interview, and I have to agree with you. I've always felt that if there was not this threat of outside interference, that Syria would have been further along on reforms and then actual democratic pursuit. So I thank you for your observations. Stay with us. We need to take a break, and next week we'll be having a program on Palestine.
Stay tuned, there's more to come after this short program ID.
You are watching The Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
That's all the time that we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. And don't forget to tune in next week with more of Jeff Klein discussing Palestine and the regional issues of the Middle East. On behalf of all of the volunteer staff here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghanwa Hakim, wishing you a pleasant week and an excellent beginning to your summer.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdullah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience. The American Arabic Benevolent Association, ABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors. The Nicholas G. Barham Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride. And by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.